Expiration dates are a legal invention, not a scientific one. Most of them describe the point at which a manufacturer is no longer willing to guarantee the product, not the point at which the food actually becomes unsafe or inedible. This distinction matters because it reveals something important about how modern food culture thinks about preservation. The assumption embedded in every expiration date is that food is inherently unstable, that it degrades on a predictable schedule, and that the consumer's job is to eat it before that schedule runs out. For the vast majority of human history, that assumption would have been unrecognizable. The people who fed themselves through winters, droughts, sea voyages, and sieges didn't work to a schedule. They worked to principles, and the foods they chose to stockpile were chosen specifically because those principles applied to them so completely that the question of expiration was essentially irrelevant. The 10 foods that follow have been found in archaeological contexts ranging from Egyptian tombs to Viking longships to sealed rooms in colonial farmhouses, still edible after decades or centuries of storage. They are not curiosities. They are the foundation of pre-industrial food security, and understanding why they don't expire is more useful than simply knowing that they don't. Honey is the most documented example of genuinely indefinite food preservation, and the reasons it does not spoil are worth understanding in full because they represent several different preservation principles operating simultaneously. Honey recovered from Egyptian tombs sealed for over 3,000 years has been tasted by archaeologists and found to be not only safe but still recognizably honey, sweet, aromatic, and structurally intact. The first mechanism is water activity. Honey contains roughly 17 to 20% water, but that water is so thoroughly bound to sugar molecules that it is unavailable to support microbial life. Bacteria and yeast require free water to grow, water that is available to them rather than chemically bonded to other compounds. Honey provides almost none. In the absence of available water, virtually no microorganism can establish itself in the honey matrix, regardless of how long it sits. The second mechanism is hydrogen peroxide production. Honey contains an enzyme called glucose oxidase, introduced by bees during the production process, that reacts with the small amount of water present to produce hydrogen peroxide, a compound with direct antimicrobial properties. The production is continuous and low-level, providing an ongoing antimicrobial effect that reinforces the water activity barrier. The third mechanism is acidity. Honey has a pH between 3.2 and 4.5, depending on floral source, acidic enough to inhibit the growth of most bacteria and many yeasts without any additional treatment. The practical implication of these three simultaneous preservation mechanisms is that honey requires only one thing to remain stable indefinitely: protection from moisture. The introduction of water from a wet spoon, condensation from an open container, or an unsealed storage environment is the only thing that can compromise honey's stability. Our ancestors stored it in sealed clay pots, wax-lined wooden vessels, and later in glass, always with the specific goal of excluding moisture. The honey itself did the rest, and it will continue to do so for as long as the seal holds. Salt's role in food preservation is so well documented that it has become almost too familiar to think about carefully, which means most people miss what makes it remarkable. Salt does not just preserve food, it is added to. Salt itself, as a pure mineral compound, is one of the most stable substances in any pantry, with no degradation mechanism available to it under normal storage conditions. The preservation principle salt exploits is osmosis. When food is placed in a high-salt environment, water is drawn out of the food cells and out of any microbial cells present through osmotic pressure. Microorganisms that depend on cellular water for their metabolic processes are effectively desiccated by high salt concentrations, their cell walls rupture, or their metabolic activity is suppressed to the point of inactivity. At salt concentrations above roughly 10% by weight in a brine solution, most pathogenic bacteria cannot survive, and many cannot survive at much lower concentrations. Our ancestors understood this effect empirically, centuries before cellular biology was described. Salt, preserved fish, and meat appear in the archaeological record of virtually every culture that had access to salt deposits or coastal salt production, and the trade in salt was significant enough to be a primary driver of ancient commerce and political geography. Roman soldiers received a salt allowance, the origin of the word salary, because salt was both a preservation necessity and a medium of exchange valuable enough to function as currency. Pure, dry salt stored in a sealed container has no expiration mechanism. It does not oxidize, ferment, or support microbial growth. The only meaningful degradation is physical, moisture absorption that causes clumping, which affects texture and ease of use, but not preservation effectiveness. Salt recovered from ancient mine workings and deposits is chemically identical to freshly produced salt. Our ancestors who stockpiled salt were stockpiling something that would outlast them, their children, and their grandchildren without any loss of function. White rice, milled, polished rice with the bran and germ removed. Stores for 25 to 30 years under proper conditions, a fact that surprises most people who think of rice as a relatively perishable grocery item. The reason white rice stores so much better than brown rice is precisely what makes it nutritionally inferior. The removal of the bran and germ eliminates the oils that would otherwise go rancid over time. Brown rice, with its oils intact, has a storage life of 6 to 12 months. White rice, stripped of those oils, has almost no oxidation pathway available to it. The conditions required for long-term white rice storage are the same conditions our ancestors maintained for all their dry goods: cool, dark, dry, and sealed against moisture and pests. Temperature is the primary variable. Rice stored at room temperature in a temperate climate will last significantly longer than rice stored in a warm, humid environment because both moisture and heat accelerate the chemical processes that degrade food over time. At consistent cool temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius, white rice stored in sealed clay jars or wooden boxes lined with cloth was a reliable long-term food reserve in agricultural societies across Asia for centuries. The stockpiling of rice was a matter of state policy in Imperial China, Japan, and Korea, where government granaries maintained multi-year rice reserves specifically as famine insurance. The management of those reserves, including rotation schedules, storage conditions, and pest control, represented some of the most sophisticated food systems administration in the pre-modern world. The insight embedded in that practice is one that our ancestors understood and modern food systems have largely abandoned, that the difference between a community that survives a bad harvest and one that does not is almost always the depth of its food reserve, not the quality of its emergency response. Dried legumes, lentils, chickpeas, dried beans, and split peas have been found in archaeological contexts dating back 10,000 years, and while the germination viability of ancient seeds degrades over time, their food value does not degrade at anything like the same rate. Lentils recovered from Bronze Age storage vessels have been analyzed and found to retain their protein content and basic nutritional profile despite millennia of storage. The preservation of dried legumes depends on the same principle as white rice, the removal of available water below the threshold at which microbial and enzymatic activity can proceed. Legumes dried to a moisture content below 12%, achievable through sun-drying or drying near a heat source, are stable against biological degradation almost indefinitely. The limiting factor in practice is insect infestation rather than microbial spoilage. Dried legumes are a target for weevils and grain moths that can devastate a stored supply within a season. Our ancestors addressed this with a range of practical interventions. Bay leaves placed throughout stored grain and legumes have a mild insect repellent effect from the volatile compounds they contain. a practice documented in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern storage traditions for centuries. Diatomaceous earth, the powdered silica shells of microscopic algae, was used in some traditions to coat stored grains and legumes. The sharp microscopic particles damage the exoskeletons of insects that come into contact with them and cause the insects to desiccate. Sealed clay storage vessels that excluded air also excluded the egg-laying insects that initiated most infestations, making the seal quality of the container a pest management strategy as well as a moisture management one. The practical storage life of properly dried, properly sealed legumes in a cool, stable environment is measured in decades rather than years, with the main quality change being an increase in cooking time as the cells harden progressively with age. Ancient legumes require long soaking and long cooking. They are not inedible. They are simply food that has been waiting longer than we have come to expect food to wait, and the patience required to cook them properly is a small price for a food source that requires no refrigeration, no processing, and no expiration date. Raw honey has already been covered in its pure form, but hardtack, the unleavened cracker made from nothing but flour, water, and salt, baked until completely dry, deserves specific attention as the most widely deployed long-term food in the pre-industrial world. It was the staple ration of sailors, soldiers, and settlers across multiple centuries and multiple continents, not because anyone particularly liked eating it, but because it worked. The preservation principle is complete moisture removal. Hardtack baked correctly, twice baked in some traditions, which is where the term biscuit originates from the French biscuit, meaning twice cooked, contains so little residual moisture that microbial activity is simply not possible. There is nothing to support it. The resulting cracker is tooth-breaking in texture, bland to the point of flavorlessness, and nutritionally adequate if monotonous. It is also essentially immortal under dry storage conditions. Hardtack recovered from American Civil War supply caches has been analyzed and found safe to eat, though accounts of those who have eaten it suggest that safe and enjoyable are not synonyms in this context. Ship's biscuit from the age of sail was routinely stored for years before issue, and the primary quality problem was not spoilage but infestation, the same weevil problem that affected dried legumes. Sailors developed the practice of breaking hardtack into water and allowing the weevils to float to the surface before eating, a piece of practical food management that says something useful about both the hardiness of the food and the standards of naval provisioning. Our ancestors who made hardtack for long journeys were applying a principle. They understood intuitively food with no water in it cannot spoil, and food that cannot spoil is the only food worth carrying when you do not know how long the journey will be. Clarified butter, butter from which the milk solids and water have been removed by slow melting and careful skimming, leaving only the pure butterfat, extends the storage life of butter from weeks to years by removing the components that make regular butter unstable. The milk solids in unclarified butter are the substrate on which spoilage bacteria operate. The water provides the environment they require. Remove both, and the remaining fat has no biological degradation pathway. Ghee, the clarified butter of South Asian culinary tradition, is the most widely known form of this preservation method, and aged ghee, stored for years or decades in sealed containers, is documented in Ayurvedic tradition as having both culinary and medicinal applications. The flavor of aged ghee changes significantly over time, developing a sharper, more complex profile that is distinctly different from fresh ghee. Whether this change is desirable is a matter of culinary tradition rather than food safety. The aged product is not spoiled, it is transformed. In European settler tradition, clarified butter was made specifically for long-term storage in households that produced more butter than could be consumed fresh. The process, slow melting, careful skimming of the foam, gentle pouring off the clear fat while leaving the milk solids in the bottom of the pan, was a standard domestic skill practiced seasonally wherever dairy animals were kept. The clarified butter was packed into sealed crocks and stored in cool cellars, where it remained usable for a year or more. The skill involved in making it correctly was modest. The payoff, a high-calorie cooking fat that did not require refrigeration, was significant enough that it was considered essential rather than optional in any household with reliable dairy access. Vinegar, particularly distilled or high-acid vinegar, has no practical expiration mechanism under normal storage conditions and has been used as both a food and a preservation medium for at least 10,000 years. The acidity that makes vinegar effective as a preservative also makes it self-preserving because at a pH below 2.5, virtually nothing lives. Vinegar does not spoil. It may develop a harmless mother, a cellulose mat produced by the bacteria responsible for fermentation, but the underlying liquid remains acidic, stable, and fully functional as a preservative regardless. Our ancestors used vinegar not just as a condiment, but as a primary preservation medium for vegetables, fruit, eggs, and meat. Pickling in vinegar creates an acidic environment hostile to the spoilage organisms and pathogens that would otherwise degrade the food, and the pickled product inherits some of the stability of the vinegar itself. A sealed jar of properly pickled vegetables in high-acid vinegar has a storage life measured in years. The vinegar used to make the pickles, when stored on its own, lasts indefinitely. The production of vinegar was a managed process in settler households. Apple cider vinegar was made from the previous autumn's apple crop, wine vinegar from surplus fermented grape juice, and grain vinegar in communities where malted grain was available. The mother culture that drove the fermentation was maintained between batches, passed between households, and treated as a resource with real value. A functioning vinegar mother in a settler community was the equivalent of a sourdough starter today, a living tool that produced a preservation medium without which the household's food security was meaningfully reduced. Pure alcohol, spirits distilled to above 40% alcohol by volume, has no expiration date because nothing biologically active can survive in it. Whiskey, brandy, rum, and gin stored in sealed bottles are chemically stable against microbial degradation for as long as the seal holds. The flavor continues to evolve through slow oxidation and the interaction of the spirit with any residual compounds in the container, but these are quality changes rather than safety changes. A bottle of whiskey sealed in 1880 is not dangerous to drink. It is, depending on the quality of the original distillation and the conditions of storage, potentially extraordinary. Our ancestors who distilled spirits were not primarily making a recreational beverage or not only making one. Spirits served as a preservation medium for fruit and herbs, as a topical antiseptic, as a heat source in extreme cold, and as a medium of exchange in frontier communities where currency was scarce. The multifunctionality of high-proof spirits made them a priority, stockpile item in any household with distilling capacity or trade access. And the stability of the product meant that a surplus accumulated in good years was available without degradation in bad ones. The stockpiling of spirits as a food security strategy was not incidental. It was deliberate. Cider and beer, which our ancestors also produced in quantity, did not have the same stability. They could sour, re-ferment, or develop off flavors over months. Distilled spirits were stable. They were concentrated. And they were universally valued, which meant they could be traded for whatever else was needed. A settler household with a full cask of whiskey had liquidity in a way that a household with only perishable goods did not. Dried, smoked, or salted fish, particularly oily species like herring, cod, and mackerel, was the protein backbone of pre-industrial food security in any community near enough to a coastline or navigable river to access it. The combination of salt and drying removes moisture through two mechanisms simultaneously: osmotic extraction from the salt and evaporative drying from air exposure, producing a final moisture content low enough that the preserved fish is stable at room temperature for months to years. Salt cod, known as bacalhau in Portuguese tradition, morue in French, and klippfisk in Norwegian, was the food that made long-distance ocean voyaging possible in the age of sail. The food that sustained Newfoundland fishing communities through their first winters, and the food that connected the economies of the North Atlantic for 4 centuries. It required no refrigeration, no cooking to remain safe, and no sophisticated storage beyond a dry, ventilated space. A settler household with a barrel of salt cod had a reliable protein source through the winter, regardless of what happened to the hunting or the livestock. The processing of fish for long-term storage was a community activity in fishing settlements. Boats landed their catch, and the entire community participated in splitting, salting, and laying out the fish to dry on wooden racks called flakes. The knowledge of how to salt correctly, how long to dry for different sizes of fish, how to assess whether the drying was complete, and how to pack the finished product without creating pockets of moisture that would cause localized spoilage was held collectively and passed down through practical apprenticeship. It was not a craft practiced by specialists. It was a survival skill practiced by everyone, because a settlement that could not preserve its fish catch did not survive its first winter. Pure, raw, unprocessed cacao, fermented and dried cacao beans, was stockpiled by Mesoamerican civilizations, most famously the Aztecs, as both a food reserve and a currency. The fermentation and drying process that follows the harvest of cacao pods produces a stable, shelf-stable bean that stores for years under dry conditions and contains a concentration of fat, stimulants, and caloric energy that made it one of the most efficient food stockpile items available in the pre-Columbian Americas. The stability of dried cacao comes from its fat content, cocoa butter, which is unusually resistant to oxidation compared to most vegetable fats, combined with a low moisture content achieved through the drying process. Fermentation, which is essential to developing the flavor compounds that make cacao taste like chocolate, also produces acids that inhibit microbial growth in the finished bean. The combination produces a food that stores well, transports easily, and delivers significant energy per unit of weight. Exactly the properties a civilization managing large logistical operations and long-distance trade needs from a stockpile item. The Aztec treasury held cacao by the tens of thousands of beans valued for exchange as well as consumption, and the scrupulousness with which cacao stores were maintained reflects the seriousness with which long-term food security was managed at a civilizational scale. What we experience as a flavor ingredient or a confectionery base, our ancestors across multiple cultures experienced as a strategic resource, something worth counting, protecting, and preserving with the same attention given to weapons and gold. The foods on this list are not relics. They are working tools, items that were set down by a society that no longer needs them in the same way. Salt is still salt. Honey is still honey. The preservation principles they embody remain valid, reliable, and available to anyone who understands them well enough to apply them. The difference between a pantry and a food reserve is not what it contains. It is whether the person who built it truly understood what they were doing and why. If this kind of knowledge interests you, the practical systems that kept people fed, warm, and alive before the modern world made all of it invisible, subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from.